The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds the way it had for 37 years, painting the same golden stripes across the oak table Margaret and I had bought at that estate sale in Millbrook. I sat alone now, same chair, same view of the lake, same blue ceramic mug with the chip on the handle that she'd refused to throw away. "It gives it character," she used to say, running her thumb over the imperfection, the same way she did with everything broken that still had use left in it. I wrapped my fingers around the warm porcelain and watched the steam rise into the October air. Clear Lake stretched beyond the window, mirror still, reflecting the morning sky like polished glass. Margaret had chosen this place 42 years ago, walking through rooms that smelled of sawdust and possibility. "This is where we'll grow old together," she'd announced, as if the decision had been made by something larger than either of us. She'd been right, of course. We had grown old here. I just hadn't expected to finish the job alone. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, each note echoing through rooms that felt too large for one person. I'd built most of the furniture myself back when my hands were steadier, and my back didn't remind me of every beam I'd lifted, every cabinet I'd hung. The dining room table where we'd hosted Christmas dinners for 30 years. The built-in bookshelves where Margaret arranged her mysteries and gardening magazines in perfect rows. The bay window seat where she'd curl up with her knitting, needles clicking in rhythm with whatever season pressed against the glass. Everything here carried her fingerprints, her choices, her laughter. Even 2 years after the funeral, I sometimes caught myself setting 2 cups on the counter before remembering. The sound of tires on gravel pulled me from my thoughts. A black SUV was turning into the driveway, too expensive and too new to belong to anyone from town. Through the windshield, I could see my son David at the wheel, his face set in the same determined expression he'd worn as a boy when he'd made up his mind about something he wanted. I hadn't seen him in 6 months, not since that awkward phone call where he had mentioned needing some space to process Margaret's death. I'd respected that space, maybe more than I should have. Margaret had always been the bridge between us, translating my practical silences into words David could understand, and his restless ambitions into something I could accept. Without her, we'd defaulted to the awkward politeness of distant relatives. David stepped out of the SUV, followed by his wife Sarah and her parents, Gerald and Patricia Whitmore. I recognized them from the wedding photos that still sat on Margaret's dresser, Gerald with his silver hair and calculating gaze, Patricia with that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. Behind them came David's teenage son from his first marriage, Michael, earbuds in, shoulders hunched in the universal posture of a kid who would rather be anywhere else. The 4 adults moved up the path like a delegation. Gerald surveyed the property with the systematic attention of a man appraising real estate. Patricia clutched her leather handbag and whispered something to Sarah that made my daughter-in-law nod with satisfaction. David walked slightly ahead, keys already in his hand, though I couldn't remember giving him a set. I opened the front door before they could knock. Old habits from my construction days, better to meet trouble on your own terms than wait for it to find you. "Dad," David's smile was bright but brittle. "You look good, David." I stepped back to let them pass. Sarah, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, Michael. The boy gave me a distracted wave, his attention already captured by something on his phone. Gerald's handshake was firm, slightly longer than necessary, the kind meant to convey authority. Patricia offered her cheek for a kiss I didn't give. Sarah smiled with her mouth, but not her eyes. The hallway suddenly felt crowded, filled with expensive perfume and cologne, and the particular tension that comes when people want something they haven't asked for yet. "Coffee?" I offered, because Margaret had trained me to be a host even when I didn't feel like one. "This won't take long," David said, which should have been my first warning. We gathered in the living room, them on the sofa Margaret had reupholstered in soft green fabric, me in my reading chair with its view of the lake. Gerald's eyes roamed the room, taking inventory of the stone fireplace I'd built by hand, the custom bookshelves, the hardwood floors Margaret and I had refinished together one humid summer. "Beautiful place," Patricia said, but her tone suggested she was already planning changes. "It was Margaret's vision," I said. "She had ideas about everything, down to which trees to plant so they'd frame the view just right." Sarah shifted uncomfortably. She'd never known how to respond when I mentioned Margaret. Some people freeze when confronted with grief, as if death might be contagious. "That's actually what we wanted to talk about," David said. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, the posture of a man delivering important news. "The future of this place." I waited. In construction, you learn that silence is often more powerful than words. People will fill quiet spaces with more truth than they intended to share. Dad, David continued, his voice taking on the patient tone you'd use with a child, you're 74 years old. This house is too big, too slated. What if you fall? What if something happens? What if it does? The question seemed to catch him off guard. Gerald leaned forward, clearly the designated spokesman for whatever they'd rehearsed in the car. Richard, let's be practical. The upkeep alone must be overwhelming. The heating bills, the maintenance, the yard work. You're not getting any younger. I looked at each of them in turn. David, fidgeting with his wedding ring. Sarah, checking her phone. Patricia, cataloging the antiques with undisguised interest. Even Michael had looked up from his screen, sensing the shift in atmosphere. So, what do you suggest? I asked quietly. David brightened, mistaking my question for capitulation. We've been looking into some really nice assisted living facilities. Places with medical staff, activities, people your own age. You'd have everything you need. And this place? The silence that followed was pregnant with unspoken plans. David glanced at Sarah, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Well, we thought, it makes sense for the family to keep it, for vacations, holidays. The kids could use it when they're older. He gestured toward Michael, who had the good grace to look uncomfortable. Your kids, I said. Not a question. Family kids, Sarah corrected smoothly. We'd take care of everything, of course. Taxes, insurance, upkeep. You wouldn't have to worry about any of it. I stood and walked to the window that faced the lake. The water was starting to show whitecaps as the morning breeze picked up. Margaret's garden was still blooming. The late roses she'd coaxed through 15 summers, the Japanese maples she'd planted to turn brilliant red this time of year. This house isn't just a house, I said without turning around. It's where Margaret and I built our life together. She's gone, Dad. David's voice was gentler now, but the words still cut. She's been gone for 2 years. Holding on to this place isn't going to bring her back. I turned to face them. 4 pairs of eyes watching me, waiting for me to crumble, to accept their logic, to make their lives easier by sacrificing my own. The house stays with me, I said quietly. Gerald's jaw tightened. Richard, be reasonable. We're not asking for charity here. We're family. Are you? I looked directly at David. When did you last visit? Not to check on the house or discuss my future, but just to spend time together? David's face flushed. That's not fair, isn't it? I walked back to my chair, each step deliberate. You show up after 6 months of silence with a plan to warehouse me and claim my home. That doesn't sound like family to me. It sounds like a business transaction. Patricia's mask of politeness finally slipped. We're trying to help you, Richard. Can't you see that? Help me what? Give up everything I've worked for? Everything Margaret and I built together? Move on, Sarah said sharply. That's what normal people do. They move on. The room went silent. Even Michael looked up from his phone, sensing the danger in the air. I appreciate your concern, I said, though appreciation was the furthest thing from what I felt. But this is my home. It will remain my home until I decide otherwise. David's shoulders sagged. For a moment, he looked like the boy who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms scared him, who'd cry when he accidentally stepped on a bug, who'd told me I was the strongest man in the world. Dad, he said quietly, please, just think about it. Think about what Mom would have wanted. It was a low blow, and he knew it, using Margaret's memory as a weapon against me. But he'd miscalculated. I knew exactly what Margaret would have wanted. She'd have wanted me to stand my ground, to protect what we'd built together, to not let anyone, even our son, take advantage of my grief. Your mother, I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest, would have wanted you to respect your father. She would have wanted you to visit because you missed me, not because you needed something from me. The words hung in the air like smoke. I could see them settling into the spaces between us, changing the shape of everything we'd been to each other. David stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. I think we should go. I think that's best. They filed out without another word. Gerald's handshake was perfunctory this time. Patricia avoided eye contact altogether. Sarah paused at the door, her expression unreadable. Think about what David said, she told me, about what would make Margaret happy. After they left, I returned to my chair and picked up my coffee mug. The liquid was cold now, but I drank it anyway, staring out at the lake that had witnessed 37 years of my marriage and 2 years of my widowhood. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking another hour in a day that had already changed everything. I thought about Margaret's desk in the study, where she'd kept our important papers in neat labeled files: insurance policies, property deeds, investment statements, all the documentation of a life lived responsibly. I thought about the will we'd drawn up together, the one that left everything to David, with the confident assumption that he'd respect what we'd built. That assumption no longer felt safe. As the morning light shifted across the room, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny ghosts, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours ago. I finished my cold coffee, set the mug on Margaret's coaster, and walked to the study where our life's work waited in manila folders and metal filing cabinets. It was time to learn exactly what I owned, what I controlled, and what I could do to protect it. Because David was right about one thing. Margaret would have wanted me to be happy, but happiness, I was beginning to understand, sometimes required drawing lines that others couldn't cross, even when those others were your own blood. The study felt different that afternoon, smaller somehow, as if the walls had drawn closer while I wasn't paying attention. Margaret's presence lingered strongest here, in the neat stacks of gardening magazines she'd never thrown away, in the fountain pen she'd used to write thank you notes, in her careful script, in the faint scent of the lavender sachets she'd tucked into every drawer. I pulled out the filing cabinet's bottom drawer, the one marked legal documents, in her precise handwriting. Our marriage certificate, yellowed at the edges. The deed to the house, our signatures bold and hopeful from 1981. Insurance policies, investment statements, and there, at the very back, the will we'd drawn up 15 years ago, when David had graduated college and seemed ready to inherit the responsibility of what we'd built. The language was simple, direct. To our beloved son David, we leave our home and all our worldly possessions, trusting that he will honor the love that built them. Margaret had insisted on that last phrase. It's not just about money, she'd said. It's about understanding what a family means. I set the will aside and opened the property deed. 43 acres of lakefront, purchased for $85,000 in 1981, now worth easily 10 times that according to the tax assessments that arrived each spring. But the worth wasn't in dollars. It was in the dock I'd built with my own hands, plank by plank. It was in the garden where Margaret had spent countless mornings, coffee mug in one hand, pruning shears in the other. It was in the tire swing that had hung from the old oak tree until David outgrew it, then hung empty for years after, a monument to childhood past. The grandfather clock chimed 3 times, pulling me back to the present. Through the study window, I could see tire tracks in the gravel where David's SUV had sat just hours ago. The marks looked deliberate, possessive, as if he had already begun claiming territory. I thought about his words. This house is too big, too isolated. What if something happens? But underneath the concern, I'd heard something else. Impatience. The tone of a man tired of waiting for his inheritance to begin. Margaret's voice echoed from memory, soft but firm. People show you who they are, Richard. The question is whether you're willing to see it. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making lists. Assets, the house, the lake property, savings accounts, investment portfolios, Margaret's jewelry, the antique furniture we'd collected over 4 decades, liabilities, property taxes, utilities, maintenance costs. It was all manageable, all within the means of a man who'd worked steady construction jobs for 30 years and saved more than he spent. But David didn't know that. He saw an old man rattling around in a big house, saw overhead and isolation and the inconvenience of a parent who refused to simplify his life to match his son's schedule. The phone rang, startling me from my calculations. The caller ID showed David's number. Dad, I hope you've had time to think about what we discussed. His voice carried that same patient tone, as if speaking to someone whose mental faculties might be slipping. I let the silence stretch before answering. I've been thinking, yes. Good, because Sarah and I have been looking at some really nice places. There's one in town, Oak Grove Manor, that has everything you'd need. Your own apartment, but with medical staff available 24/7. They even have a woodworking shop. How thoughtful of them to provide a hobby room. Dad, I'm being serious. This isn't about us wanting to take anything from you. It's about making sure you're safe. I looked out at the lake, where a pair of loons was gliding across the surface, their calls echoing off the water. Margaret had loved those loons, said their voices reminded her that some things remained unchanged even as the world grew stranger around them. David, I said quietly, when did you stop trusting my judgment? What do you mean? I built this house. I've maintained it for 42 years. I know every beam, every wire, Every pipe. What makes you think I can't continue to manage it? There was a pause, the sound of muffled conversation. Sarah's voice in the background, urgent but indistinct. Dad, we just want what's best for everyone. The whole family. The whole family, I repeated. That's interesting phrasing. What's that supposed to mean? I set down my pen and leaned back in Margaret's chair, feeling the worn places where her shoulders had rested during countless evenings of correspondence and bill paying. It means I wonder when I became a problem to be solved instead of a father to be visited. That's not... Dad, you're twisting things. We love you. We want to help. Help or inherit? The silence that followed was answer enough. When David spoke again, his voice had hardened. I don't think you're being rational about this. Maybe you should talk to someone. Dr. Morrison, maybe. Get a professional perspective on what's best for your health. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Question my mental competency. Plant seeds of doubt about my ability to make decisions. I'd seen it happen to other men my age, loving families gradually assuming control for their own good, until they found themselves signing papers they didn't understand, moving to places they didn't choose. I think this conversation is over, I said. Dad, wait. I hung up and sat staring at the phone, my heart beating faster than it should. The house around me felt suddenly fragile, as if David's ambitions could somehow reach through the walls and begin dismantling what Margaret and I had built. But fragile didn't mean defenseless. I opened the yellow pages to the section marked Attorneys and found the number I was looking for. Marcus Henley had handled the legal work when we'd bought the house, had drawn up our wills, had been a friend more than a lawyer. If anyone could help me understand my options, it was Marcus. His secretary put me through immediately. Richard, how are you holding up? I've been meaning to call since Margaret's service. I'm managing, Marcus, but I need some advice, legal advice. What can I do for you? I told him about David's visit, about the pressure to move, about the veiled threats regarding my mental competency. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally making soft sounds of understanding. Richard, he said when I finished, what exactly are you looking for here? Do you want to change your will? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Did I? 3 hours ago, the answer would have been an immediate no. David was my son, my only child, the inheritor of everything Margaret and I had worked for. But that was before I'd seen the calculation in his eyes, heard the impatience in his voice, felt the weight of being measured and found inconvenient. I want to understand my options, I said carefully. I want to know what I can and can't do with my own property. Everything's in your name. Margaret's interest passed to you automatically. You can do whatever you want. Sell, transfer, gift, hold on to it until you die. It's your decision entirely. And if someone challenges my mental competency, Marcus's voice sharpened. Has someone threatened to do that? Not directly, but the suggestion was made that I should see a doctor, get a professional perspective on my decision-making. Richard, listen to me carefully. You're 74 years old. You live independently. You manage your own affairs. You're clearly thinking rationally. Any competency challenge would be an uphill battle for whoever filed it. But if you're concerned, we can take some preemptive steps, such as current medical evaluations showing you're in good health, both physically and mentally, documentation of your financial management, maybe most importantly, a clear paper trail showing that any changes you make to your estate planning are deliberate and well-reasoned, not impulsive reactions to family pressure. I thought about David's voice on the phone, about Sarah's calculating gaze, about Gerald and Patricia examining my home like appraisers. Marcus, if I wanted to change my will, hypothetically, how would I go about it? Carefully, he said, and with a lot of documentation showing exactly why you were making the changes. When can you come in? Tomorrow morning? I'll clear my schedule. After I hung up, I walked through the house as if seeing it for the first time. The living room where Margaret had arranged furniture to encourage conversation. The kitchen where we'd shared 40 years of morning coffee and evening wine. The bedroom where we'd slept side by side until cancer took her from the bed beside me and left only the impression of her head on a pillow I couldn't bring myself to wash. In the hallway, I stopped before the photo gallery Margaret had created. 4 decades of family pictures arranged with her artist's eye for balance and story. There was David at 2, chocolate cake smeared across his face at his birthday party. At 7, missing his front teeth but grinning as he held up the base he'd caught off our dock. At 16, serious in his baseball uniform. At 25, nervous and proud in his wedding tuxedo, Sarah radiant beside him. When had that eager boy become the calculating man who'd sat in my living room this morning, measuring my home like a surveyor? I took down one of the photos, David at 8, helping me rebuild the dock after a storm. His face was streaked with mud, his t-shirt soaked, but his smile was pure joy. He'd work beside me all afternoon, handling boards, fetching tools, chattering about his plans to be a builder like his dad when he grew up. "We make a good team, don't we, Dad?" he'd said as we'd stood back to admire our work. "The best team," I'd told him, and meant it. Now that same boy was a man who spoke of me in the third person, who made plans for my future without consulting me, who saw my independence as an inconvenience to be managed. I set the photo back in its place and continued to Margaret's sewing room. She'd spent countless hours here, creating quilts for every bed in the house, mending clothes that could have been replaced more cheaply, working with her hands because she believed in the value of making things that lasted. Her sewing machine sat silent now, covered with a sheet I'd placed over it the day after her funeral. On the cutting table lay her last project, a quilt she'd been making for David and Sarah's 5th anniversary. The pattern was called Wedding Ring, interlocking circles in shades of blue and gold. She'd finished perhaps a third of it before the illness took her strength, before her steady hands could no longer guide fabric through precise seams. I touched one of the completed rings, feeling the careful stitches that held the pieces together. Margaret had believed in permanence, in things made to last generations. But permanence, I was learning, required protection. It required someone willing to guard what others might too easily discard or claim. The evening light was fading when I finally returned to the study. I pulled out a fresh piece of paper and began writing, not a will or legal document, but a letter to the wife I'd buried 2 years ago. Dear Margaret, David came by today with plans for my future, plans that don't include this house, this lake, this life we built together. He thinks I'm too old to manage on my own, thinks I need to be somewhere safer. What he really thinks is that I'm in his way. You always said I was too trusting, that I saw what I wanted to see in people instead of what was really there. I think you were right. I wanted to see our boy in the man who sat in our living room today, but that boy is gone. In his place is someone who looks at our home and sees dollar signs, who measures my worth in terms of convenience. I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but I know I won't let them take what we built. Not without a fight. I miss you every day. I miss your voice telling me to be practical, to think things through. But I also miss your strength, the way you never backed down when something mattered. This matters. All my love, Richard. I folded the letter and slipped it into Margaret's desk drawer, next to the fountain pen she'd treasured and the reading glasses she'd never needed but wore because they made her feel scholarly. Tomorrow I would see Marcus. Tomorrow I would begin understanding exactly what weapons were available to a man defending his own life. But tonight, I sat in the gathering darkness of the home Margaret and I had made together, listening to the grandfather clock count the hours and the lake whisper against the shore. Outside, the October wind was picking up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the deck. Change was coming. I could feel it in the air, in the set of my shoulders, in the steel that had entered my spine somewhere between David's ultimatum and my own quiet revelation. My son had made his choice. Now I would make mine. The invitation came 3 days later, delivered not by David himself, but through Sarah's careful handwriting on cream-colored cardstock that probably cost more per sheet than I spent on groceries in a week. The formality of it struck me immediately, not a phone call or casual text, but an actual invitation, as if this were a business meeting disguised as a family gathering. Richard, we would be honored to have you join us for dinner this Sunday at 6 p.m. Gerald and Patricia are visiting from Phoenix, and we thought it would be lovely to have the whole family together. We have some exciting plans to share with you. With love, Sarah, David, and Michael. P.S. We've made reservations at Millbrook Inn. We know how much you and Margaret enjoyed dining there. I read it twice, feeling the careful calculation behind each word. The mention of Margaret was deliberate, a reminder of shared history, an appeal to sentiment. The choice of Millbrook Inn, where Margaret and I had celebrated our last anniversary, was meant to soften my resistance. Even the phrase exciting plans carried the assumption that I would be excited by whatever they had orchestrated. But it was the postscript that bothered me most. Margaret and I had indeed loved Millbrook Inn, but we'd always sat in the small dining room overlooking the garden, speaking in low voices about private things. The main dining room, where they'd likely made reservations, was public, performative, a place where raised voices would be noticed and discouraged. They were choosing the battlefield as carefully as generals. I called Marcus that afternoon. They want to meet on neutral ground, I told him. Somewhere I can't easily walk away, somewhere they can control the conversation. What are you going to do? I looked out at the lake, where the afternoon light was turning the water to hammered copper. A great blue heron stood motionless in the shallows, waiting with the infinite patience of a creature that understood the value of perfect timing. I'm going to go, I said, but I'm going armed. Marcus had spent the week helping me understand exactly what I owned and what I could do with it. The house and property were mine entirely. Margaret's share had passed to me automatically upon her death. The investment accounts we'd built over 40 years of careful saving were substantial enough to fund a comfortable retirement without requiring any lifestyle changes. I wasn't the doddering old man who needed management that David seemed to think I was. More importantly, Marcus had helped me understand my options. The will that left everything to David could be changed at any time, for any reason, as long as I was mentally competent. And despite David's veiled suggestions otherwise, 3 different doctors had confirmed that my mental faculties were not only intact, but sharper than many men 20 years younger. If you decide to make changes, Marcus had warned, document everything. Write down your reasons, your thought processes, date and sign everything. If anyone challenges your competency later, we want a clear paper trail showing that these weren't impulsive decisions, but carefully considered responses to changed circumstances. Sunday evening arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made you think of football games and harvest festivals. I dressed carefully, not the casual clothes David had grown accustomed to seeing me in, but the charcoal suit I'd worn to Margaret's funeral, the one that made me look like a man who expected to be taken seriously. Millbrook Inn sat on the town square, a restored Victorian that had been serving dinner to 3 generations of local families. The hostess, a young woman I didn't recognize, led me through the main dining room to a round table near the windows. David and Sarah were already seated, along with Gerald and Patricia. Michael was noticeably absent. "Dad!" David stood to embrace me, the gesture warm but somehow performative. "You look great." "Doesn't he look great, Sarah?" Sarah smiled with the practiced warmth of a politician's wife. "Wonderful. We're so glad you could join us." Gerald rose to shake my hand, his grip firm and assessing. Patricia offered her cheek for a kiss I didn't give, settling instead for a polite nod. The table was set with the inn's best china and crystal, wine glasses already filled with something red and expensive looking. "This is nice," I said, taking my assigned seat. "Feels almost like a celebration." "In a way it is," Sarah said, her eyes bright with anticipation. "We have so much to share with you." The waiter appeared with menus, but David waved him away. "We've already ordered for everyone. The prime rib special. I know it's your favorite, Dad." Another calculated move. Taking away my choices, however small, establishing who was in control. I said nothing, but I noticed everything. The way they'd positioned themselves around the table, the careful choreography of their smiles, the wine glass placed at my elbow as if they assumed I'd drink without question. "So," Gerald said, settling back in his chair with the air of a man chairing a board meeting, "Sarah tells us you've been giving some thought to your living situation." "Some thought," I agreed. "It's a big decision," Patricia added, her voice syrupy with false sympathy. "But at your age, independence can become more of a burden than a blessing." I sipped my water. I'd touched neither the wine nor the bread they had ordered, and let them talk. They had their script prepared, their talking points rehearsed. David spoke about safety and medical emergencies. Sarah mentioned the social benefits of assisted living. Gerald cited statistics about falls and accidents among elderly men living alone. Through it all, I watched their faces, saw the subtle signals that passed between them. This wasn't a family dinner. It was an intervention. "The facility we toured has everything," David was saying. "Your own kitchenette, but meals available if you don't want to cook. Activities, transportation to medical appointments, even a workshop where you could do some woodworking." "Like a hobby," I said. "Exactly. And the best part is, you wouldn't have to worry about any of the house maintenance anymore. No more worrying about the roof or the heating system or cutting all that grass." "What happens to the house?" The question hung in the air like smoke. David glanced at Sarah, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Well, that's part of what we wanted to discuss," Sarah said. "We've been thinking about moving closer to you, actually. The city is getting so expensive, and with Michael starting high school, we thought a change might be good for everyone. You want to move into my house." "We want to keep it in the family," David corrected. "Keep it maintained, lived in, loved. Isn't that what Mom would have wanted?" There it was again, Margaret's memory used as a weapon against me. But this time, instead of anger, I felt something colder and more useful: clarity. Your mother, I said quietly, would have wanted me to make my own decisions about my own life. Patricia leaned forward, her diamond bracelet catching the light. But, Richard, surely you can see how this benefits everyone. You get the care and companionship you need, David and Sarah get to raise Michael in a wholesome environment, and the house stays in the family where it belongs. Where it belongs, I repeated. Gerald nodded emphatically. Exactly. Property like that shouldn't sit empty while you're living in some sterile apartment. This way, everyone wins. The waiter brought our meals, slabs of prime rib that I had no appetite for, accompanied by Yorkshire pudding and roasted vegetables. The others began eating with the enthusiasm of people confident that they'd made their case successfully. I cut a small piece of meat, chewed it slowly, and thought about the letter I'd written to Margaret 3 nights ago, about the quilt she'd never finished, with its interlocking rings meant to symbolize permanence and commitment, about the boy in the photograph who'd wanted to be a builder like his father, and the man he'd become who saw only opportunities in other people's loss. There's one thing I don't understand, I said. David looked up from his plate, fork halfway to his mouth. What's that? When did you stop seeing me as your father and start seeing me as an obstacle? The table went quiet. Patricia's fork clinked against her plate. Gerald reached for his wine glass. Sarah's smile faltered for just a moment before reassembling itself. Dad, David said carefully, that's not. We're trying to help you. Are you? Or are you trying to help yourselves? What's that supposed to mean? I set down my fork and looked directly at my son. It means I know what assisted living costs in this area. It means I know what my house is worth. It means I can do the math on who benefits from this arrangement and who pays for it. David's face flushed. If you're suggesting that we're somehow... I'm not suggesting anything. I'm observing. You want me to spend down my savings on care I don't need, so you can inherit a house you haven't earned. Gerald's voice took on a sharper edge. Now, see here, Richard. That's hardly fair. David is your son. Naturally, he'd inherit... Naturally? I turned my attention to him. And what makes you think that's natural? What makes you think I owe any of you anything? The question seemed to genuinely puzzle them. Patricia blinked rapidly, as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. Sarah's mouth opened and closed without sound. It was David who finally answered, and his voice carried the petulant tone of a child denied a promised toy. Because I'm your son. Because that's how families work. Parents provide for their children. I provided for you for 18 years, paid for your education, helped with your wedding, bought you your first car. At what point do you start providing for yourself? That's different. That was parenting. This is what, David? He struggled for words, his face growing redder. This is you being selfish. You're sitting on property you don't need, money you can't spend, refusing to let the people who love you help you make rational decisions. Rational decisions. I tasted the words, found them bitter. Like moving into a facility I don't want so you can move into a house you didn't build? Dad, please. Sarah's voice was soft, pleading. We're not your enemies here. We're your family. We love you. I looked around the table at these people who claimed to love me. At Gerald, who had been calculating the value of my property since the moment he'd walked through my front door. At Patricia, who'd examined my antiques like a prospective buyer. At Sarah, whose concerns seemed directly proportional to her interest in my real estate. At David, who spoke about my future as if I weren't sitting right there to speak for myself. If you love me, I said quietly, you'll respect my decision to stay in my own home, living my own life, making my own choices. If you can't do that, then what you feel isn't love. It's something else entirely. I stood, pulled out my wallet, and placed enough cash on the table to cover my portion of the meal I hadn't eaten. Where are you going? David demanded. Home. To the house I built with my own hands, bought with my own money, where I'll live until I decide otherwise. Dad, sit down. We're not finished. I looked at him one last time, the stranger who wore my son's face and spoke with my son's voice but had somehow lost my son's heart. Yes, I said, we are. The drive home took 20 minutes, but it felt like traveling through decades. Past the farm where I'd bought Christmas trees when David was small, past the baseball diamond where he'd played Little League, where Margaret and I had sat on bleachers cheering for a boy who'd beam at us from the pitcher's mound, past the high school where he'd graduated with honors, full of dreams and plans that seemed to include us then. When had those dreams changed? When had we become inconveniences to be managed rather than parents to be cherished? The house was dark when I arrived, but I could see moonlight reflecting off the lake, turning the water into a sheet of hammered silver. I sat in the car for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, feeling the weight of the evening settle around me. Tomorrow I would call Marcus. Tomorrow I would begin the process of rewriting my will, of protecting what Margaret and I had built from people who saw only dollar signs where we had invested our hearts. But tonight, I simply sat in the driveway of the home I'd defended, listening to the familiar sounds of water lapping against the dock and wind moving through the trees Margaret had planted. Inside, the grandfather clock chimed 9 times as I hung up my suit jacket and loosened my tie. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the tire swing that still hung from the oak tree, motionless in the still airs. 40 years ago, I'd hung that swing for a boy who'd believed his father could do anything, fix anything, make anything right. That boy was gone, but the swing remained, a monument to faith that had once existed between a father and son. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new betrayals to navigate. But tonight, I was home, surrounded by the life Margaret and I had chosen, protected by walls we'd built, and memories that couldn't be taken away or sold off or managed by people who'd forgotten the difference between love and ownership. The real fight was just beginning, but for the first time since David had walked into my living room with his plans for my future, I felt ready for it. Marcus Henley's law office occupied the second floor of a brick building that had been watching over Main Street since before I was born. The stairs creaked under my feet the same way they had 30 years ago, when Margaret and I had first climbed them to discuss buying the lake house. Some things, I was learning, had the decency to stay constant. Marcus hadn't changed much either. His hair had gone completely white, and he moved more carefully than he used to, but his eyes were still sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses that had probably been fashionable sometime in the Carter administration. He listened to my account of Sunday's dinner without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad with a fountain pen that looked older than some countries. "So they want you in assisted living and themselves in your house," he said when I finished, "and they're using your wife's memory to justify it. That's about the size of it." He set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Richard, I've been practicing law for 47 years. I've seen every kind of family dispute you can imagine, and some you probably can't. What your son is doing isn't unusual, but that doesn't make it right. What are my options? More than you might think, less than you might want." He pulled a fresh legal pad from his desk drawer. "Let's start with what you can't do. You can't prevent them from having opinions about your living situation. You can't stop them from making suggestions or even applying pressure. What you can do is make sure that pressure doesn't matter." He began sketching what looked like a flowchart, boxes and arrows connecting various possibilities. First option, revocable living trust. You transfer all your assets into a trust with yourself as trustee. Legally, you still control everything, but it makes the estate planning cleaner and harder to challenge. What's the downside? Cost, complexity, and it doesn't really solve your immediate problem. Your son can still pressure you to modify the trust. Marcus drew another box. Second option, irrevocable trust. Much stronger protection, but you give up direct control of the assets. The trust owns everything, and you're essentially a beneficiary of your own estate. I thought about that for a moment. Seems like I'd be doing their work for them, taking away my own control. Exactly why I don't recommend it for your situation. He drew a third box. Option 3. Rewrite your will with very specific language about why you're making changes. Document everything, dates, conversations, attempts at coercion. Make it clear that these are rational decisions made by a competent person responding to changed circumstances. And if they challenge my competency anyway? Marcus smiled grimly. That's where documentation becomes your best friend. We'll have you evaluated by multiple physicians, not just your regular doctor, but specialists. Cognitive assessment, psychological evaluation, the works. We'll create a paper trail showing that you're not only competent, but actively engaged in making complex financial and legal decisions. He drew one final box, larger than the others, with multiple arrows pointing away from it. Option 4, and this is the nuclear option. Change the will entirely. Don't leave the property to David at all. The words hung in the air like a challenge. 3 days ago, the idea would have been unthinkable. David was my only child, my heir, the one who was supposed to carry forward what Margaret and I had built. But that was before I'd seen the calculation in his eyes, felt the weight of being measured and found inconvenient. Who would I leave it to? Anyone you want. A charity, a foundation, the local historical society. You could even establish a scholarship fund in Margaret's name. Marcus leaned forward. The point isn't necessarily to disinherit your son forever. It's to make clear that inheritance is a privilege, not a right, and that privilege can be revoked. I thought about the boy in the photographs, the one who had wanted to build things alongside his father. Then I thought about the man who'd ordered my dinner without asking, who'd spoken about my future as if I were a problem to be solved. What would Margaret have wanted? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Marcus set down his pen and looked at me with the kind of expression that comes from decades of helping people navigate the gap between what they hoped for and what they got. Richard, Margaret wanted you to be happy. She wanted you to be respected and cared for in your old age. If your son can't provide that respect and care, then maybe she'd want you to find other ways to ensure it. How long would this take? The evaluations? 2 weeks, maybe 3. Writing a new will? We could have a draft by Friday if you decide to go ahead. And if I do this, if I change everything, there's no going back, is there? Even if David comes to his senses later, the damage to our relationship... Marcus nodded slowly. That's the real cost, isn't it? Not the legal fees or the time, but the acknowledgement that your relationship with your son has changed in ways that might not be fixable. I left Marcus's office with appointments scheduled for medical evaluations and a promise to call him within the week with my decision. The late morning air was crisp with the promise of winter, and Main Street was busy with the kind of purposeful activity that came with changing seasons. People buying Halloween decorations, winterizing their gardens, preparing for the long months ahead. At the hardware store, I bought new locks for the lake house. Deadbolts that couldn't be opened with copies of old keys. Window locks that would require more than gentle pressure to bypass. The clerk, a young man I didn't recognize, asked if I was having security problems. Just updating some things, I said, which was true enough. Smart man. Too many folks wait until after they've been robbed. Back home, I spent the afternoon installing the new locks with the methodical precision of a man who'd spent 40 years working with his hands. The familiar weight of tools, the satisfaction of work done properly. These things grounded me in ways that legal consultations and family confrontations couldn't. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the early years in this house, when David had been small enough to help by handing me screws and holding flashlights. He'd been fascinated by the way things worked, always asking questions about electricity and plumbing and the mysterious processes that made houses function. Why do we need 2 locks on the front door, Dad? Because sometimes one isn't enough to keep out things you don't want inside. Like burglars? Like anyone who doesn't belong here. I'd been talking about strangers then. I never imagined I might someday use those words about my own son. The phone rang as I was testing the new kitchen window locks. David's number appeared on the caller ID, but I let it go to the machine. His message was brief, his tone carefully controlled. Dad, we need to talk about Sunday night. I think there were some misunderstandings. Call me back. I didn't. Instead, I called Dr. Sarah Chen, my primary physician, and scheduled the comprehensive physical Marcus had recommended. Then I called Dr. Mitchell Patterson, a neuropsychologist Marcus had suggested, and arranged for cognitive testing. The wheels were beginning to turn. That evening, I sat at Margaret's desk and began writing. Not a legal document, that would come later, but a letter to David, one I might never send but needed to write. David, I've been thinking about Sunday night, about the things you said and the assumptions you made. You spoke about me as if I weren't sitting right there, made plans for my life as if my preferences didn't matter. You used your mother's memory as justification for decisions she would never have supported. I want you to know that I understand what you're trying to do. You see an old man living alone in a big house, and you think that's wasteful, inefficient, possibly dangerous. You see property that could be put to better use, meaning use that benefits you and your family, rather than gathering dust under the ownership of someone you consider too old to appreciate it properly. What you don't see is that this house isn't just property to me. It's the physical embodiment of a marriage that lasted 40 years, of dreams realized and sacrifices made, and love built board by board, room by room. Every fixture, every piece of trim, every carefully chosen paint color represents a decision your mother and I made together. You want me to abandon all of that so you can move in and make your own decisions, create your own memories, raise your own family in spaces that were sacred to mine. You want me to pay for the privilege of being displaced, to spend my savings on care I don't need, so you can inherit wealth you haven't earned. I'm writing this letter to tell you that's not going to happen. Not now, not ever, not while I have breath in my body and the legal right to make decisions about my own life. If you want a relationship with your father, you'll have to accept that he's still capable of thinking for himself. If you can't do that, then maybe we don't have a relationship worth saving. Your father, Richard. I folded the letter and placed it in the desk drawer next to the one I'd written to Margaret. Someday I might send it. Someday I might not need to. But writing it had clarified something important. I wasn't just defending a house or protecting an inheritance. I was drawing a line between the man I'd been and the man I was becoming. The medical appointments took 2 weeks. Dr. Chen found me in excellent health for a man of 74. Blood pressure controlled, cholesterol manageable, heart strong despite my age. She conducted cognitive screening tests that I passed without difficulty and wrote a detailed report documenting my mental acuity and decision-making capacity. Dr. Patterson's evaluation was more extensive. 3 hours of psychological testing that measured everything from memory and problem-solving to emotional stability and reality testing. His report, when it came, was glowing. Patient demonstrates cognitive function in the superior range for his age group, with no evidence of impairment in judgment, reasoning, or decision-making capacity. Marcus reviewed both reports with obvious satisfaction. If anyone challenges your competency now, they'll have to explain how a man who scores in the superior range on cognitive testing is somehow too impaired to manage his own affairs. What's next? Next, you decide what you want to do. I can draft a simple codicil to your existing will, changing specific bequests while leaving the basic structure intact, or I can write an entirely new will that distributes your assets according to different priorities. I thought about David's voice on my answering machine, the messages that had grown more frequent and more urgent as the days passed. He'd left 6 calls in the past week, each one a variation on the same theme: confusion about my silence, concern for my welfare, suggestions that we work together to find solutions that made everyone happy. He still didn't understand, still thought this was a negotiation where compromise was possible, where family loyalty trumped personal autonomy, where his convenience mattered more than my dignity. Write a new will, I said. Leave the house and property to the Margaret Dalton Foundation for lake conservation. Everything else can be divided between environmental groups and veterans organizations. Marcus raised an eyebrows. Everything? What about David? I thought about the boy who'd wanted to build things, about the man who wanted to tear down what others had built, about the difference between earning something and simply expecting it. David gets Margaret's engagement ring and the family photos, everything he ever earned from us, plus the memories of what he chose to throw away. Marcus wrote steadily, filling yellow pages with the legal language that would transform my intentions into unbreakable law. As he worked, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Peace. Not happiness, that would come later, if at all, but the deep satisfaction of a man who'd stopped running from a fight and had finally chosen his ground. The new will was signed and notarized on a Thursday afternoon in early November. Marcus kept the original in his office safe. I took a copy home and placed it in the same desk drawer where my letters waited. The documents that would reshape my family's future lay next to fountain pens and stamp collections and all the other remnants of a life shared with someone who'd understood that love sometimes required drawing lines others couldn't cross. That evening, I called David. "Dad, finally! I was getting worried. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, David. I'm calling to invite you to dinner." "Dinner? That's great. When?" "This Sunday, at the lake house. Just you and Sarah and Michael. There are some things we need to discuss." "Of course. Should we bring anything?" I looked out at the lake, where the first thin skin of ice was forming along the shoreline. Winter was coming, and with it the long months when the house would be truly isolated, truly mine. "Just yourselves," I said, "and an open mind." "Dad, I know things got a little heated last time, but we can work through this. We're family." "Yes," I agreed. "We are. And Sunday, you'll learn exactly what that means." After I hung up, I walked through the house one more time, seeing it with new eyes. These rooms that had witnessed 40 years of marriage, 2 years of mourning, and now this, the systematic dismantling of assumptions that had governed my relationship with my son for 37 years. Margaret's quilt still lay unfinished on her sewing table, its interlocking rings a testament to plans interrupted by mortality. But some interruptions, I was learning, opened space for new patterns to emerge. Some endings made room for different kinds of beginnings. Sunday was 3 days away. 3 days to prepare for a conversation that would change everything between us, one way or another. 3 days to ready myself for the moment when David would finally understand that his father was not the manageable old man he'd believed him to be. I was done being managed, done being convenient, done pretending that family obligation meant accepting disrespect from people who should have known better. The real war was about to begin. The safety deposit box had been a revelation. Margaret's final gift to me wasn't just legal documents and research. It was a complete battle plan, detailed enough to rival any military strategy I'd encountered during my brief service years. She'd anticipated every move David might make, every argument he might use, every pressure point he might try to exploit. Among her papers, I'd found something unexpected: the business card of Jake Sullivan, a local technology consultant who specialized in what he called aging-in-place solutions. Clipped to the card was a note in Margaret's careful handwriting. If they claim you're not safe alone, make sure you have proof that you are, M. Now, 3 days after my meeting with Marcus, I sat in my kitchen at 7 in the morning, Jake Sullivan's business card in one hand and my coffee in the other, finally understanding what Margaret had been planning. Jake arrived at 9 sharp, driving a van loaded with equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. He was probably 40, with the kind of easy competence that came from working with his hands and the casual dress of someone who spent his days crawling under houses and threading wires through walls. "Mr. Hartwell," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that suggested both respect and capability. "I was sorry to hear about Mrs. Hartwell's passing. She was a remarkable lady." "You knew Margaret?" "She hired me 2 years ago to install the security system at the library. Spent hours asking questions about how the technology worked, what it could and couldn't do. Smart woman, asked better questions than most of my commercial clients." I led him into the living room, where he set down a tablet computer and began making notes about room dimensions, window placement, electrical outlets. "She called me about 6 months before she died," Jake continued, his tone careful in the way people adopt when discussing the recently deceased. "Said she was thinking about upgrading your home security, but wanted to wait until the time was right. Asked me to put together a comprehensive proposal and hold on to it until you were ready." He pulled out a manila folder that looked familiar, the same type Margaret had used for all her important papers. "This is what we discussed," he said, opening the folder to reveal detailed floor plans of our house, marked with symbols and notes I didn't understand. "Complete smart home integration, designed specifically for someone who wants to age in place safely and independently." I studied the plans, seeing our familiar rooms transformed into something that looked more like a space station than a lake house. "What exactly does complete smart home integration involve?" Jake's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who loved his work. "Everything connected, everything monitored, everything designed to keep you safe and give you complete control over your environment. Smart locks that you can operate from anywhere, security cameras with motion detection, environmental controls you can adjust from your phone, emergency alert systems that can call for help even if you can't reach a phone." That sounds expensive. It is, but Mrs. Hartwell was very specific about what she wanted included. He flipped to another page showing a detailed cost breakdown. She also left a check to cover the full installation. The check was clipped to the back of the folder, Margaret's careful handwriting authorizing payment for services that wouldn't be needed until after her death. The amount made me whistle softly. She really thought this through. She did. "But Mr. Hartwell, I need to ask, are you ready for this? Because once we start, your house is going to be turned upside down for about a week. And when we're finished, you'll have more control over your environment than most people know what to do with." I thought about David's message from the night before, about Jessica's call to Marcus, about the increasing pressure to prove I was competent to live independently. "Let's do it." The installation began the next morning and immediately turned my orderly life into controlled chaos. Jake arrived with 2 assistants and enough equipment to stock a small electronics store. They moved through the house like surgical residents, careful not to damage anything but relentless in their progress. The smart locks went in first, biometric readers that would recognize my fingerprint, keypad entry for backup, and wireless connectivity that would let me lock or unlock any door from my phone. The old brass hardware Margaret and I had chosen together was preserved and integrated into the new system so seamlessly that the technology seemed to disappear into the traditional aesthetic. The beauty of modern smart home tech, Jake explained, as he calibrated the front door lock, is that it can be completely invisible. No blinking lights, no obvious cameras, no indication that anything's changed unless you know what to look for. The security cameras were even more impressive. Tiny devices no larger than smoke detectors, positioned to monitor every entrance and most interior spaces without creating the feeling of living in a surveillance state. The main control unit lived in Margaret's study, its screen showing views of the property from angles I'd never seen before. Motion detection, night vision, automatic recording when triggered, Jake said, adjusting the camera angles on his tablet. But here's the real magic. Facial recognition software that can distinguish between family members, neighbors, delivery people, and strangers. You can program it to send different alerts depending on who's approaching the house. Different alerts? Your son shows up, you get a gentle notification. A stranger approaches after dark, you get an immediate alarm with automatic notification to local police if you don't respond within 60 seconds. The environmental controls were equally sophisticated. Every thermostat, every light switch, every ceiling fan could be operated remotely. But more than that, the system could learn my daily routines and adjust automatically, raising the temperature before I woke up, turning on lights as sunset approached, even starting the coffee maker at the same time each morning. Why would I need to control everything remotely? I asked as Jake demonstrated the smartphone app that had become the command center for my entire house. Because independence isn't just about being able to do things yourself, he said. It's about being able to do them efficiently, safely, and with backup systems in case something goes wrong. He showed me how to set automated routines, lights that would turn on in sequence to simulate occupancy when I was away, security cameras that would send alerts to Tom Morrison if they detected problems, even systems that would monitor my daily activity patterns and send wellness checks to designated contacts if my routine changed dramatically. Your wife was particularly interested in this feature, Jake said, pulling up a screen labeled Daily Living Patterns. The system can learn your normal activities, when you get up, when you make coffee, when you check the mail, and alert someone if those patterns change in ways that might indicate a problem. Someone like David? Someone like whoever you designate. Could be your son, could be a neighbor, could be your doctor. The point is that you stay in control of who gets notified and when. On the third day of installation, David called. "Dad, I drove by yesterday and saw all the work trucks in your driveway. What's going on?" I was standing in Margaret's study, watching Jake program the central control unit, surrounded by enough technology to run a small corporation. Home improvements. What kind of improvements? The question was sharper than casual curiosity warranted, as if he needed to catalog every change I made to the property that might affect its eventual disposition. Security upgrades. Margaret always wanted better locks on the doors. Security upgrades? Dad, you live in the middle of nowhere. What are you securing against? I looked at the bank of monitors showing every approach to the house, the smartphone that would now alert me to any unusual activity, the door locks that would deny entry to anyone I hadn't specifically authorized. Peace of mind, I said. That afternoon, Tom Morrison stopped by to see the work in progress. He stood in the living room, hands on his hips, studying the nearly invisible cameras and sophisticated control panels with the appreciation of someone who understood quality craftsmanship. "This is some serious equipment, Rich," he said, like something you'd see in a corporate security office. "Jake says it's all standard smart home technology now. Maybe, but this is the premium version. Your Margaret knew what she was doing when she planned this." Jake emerged from the basement, wiping his hands on a towel. "We're ready for the final systems test, Mr. Hartwell. Want to see how everything works together?" The demonstration was impressive. From my smartphone, I could view any room in the house, adjust lighting and temperature, lock or unlock doors, and even communicate through an intercom system that connected to outdoor speakers. The security features were equally comprehensive: motion-triggered recording, automatic emergency notifications, and facial recognition software that could identify regular visitors versus strangers. "But here's the real advantage," Jake said, pulling up the system's main dashboard. "Everything is logged. Every door opening, every motion detection, every system activation. If anyone ever questions your ability to live independently, you'll have detailed records proving that you're managing just fine. And if someone questions whether I'm really here when I claim to be," Jake smiled, "biometric locks don't lie. Every time you use your fingerprint to enter the house, the system creates a timestamp that would hold up in any legal proceeding. The installation was completed on a Friday morning. Jake and his team packed up their tools, tested every system one final time, and left me with a house that looked exactly as it had before, but functioned like something from a science fiction novel. That evening, I sat in Margaret's reading chair with the system control tablet in my lap, marveling at what she'd arranged for me. Every screen showed green status indicators. Every camera provided a clear view of the surrounding property. Every sensor was active and responsive. But more than the technology itself, I was struck by the completeness of Margaret's vision. She'd understood that the challenge wouldn't just be proving I was competent to live alone, it would be proving it continuously, in the face of persistent doubt from people who had their own reasons for wanting me to appear incompetent. The smart home system wasn't just about security or convenience. It was about documentation. Every day I remained in the house, every task I completed independently, every visitor I welcomed or turned away would be recorded with the kind of precision that would make any legal challenge extremely difficult to sustain. The first test came sooner than I'd expected. Saturday afternoon, I was in the workshop when the security system chimed softly. My phone lit up with an alert. Motion detected at front entrance. Unrecognized vehicle in driveway. I opened the security app and saw Jessica's car pulling up beside my truck. She got out alone, wearing jeans and a casual jacket, looking more like someone making a friendly visit than someone conducting reconnaissance. But the system had already begun recording, time-stamping her arrival, documenting her presence. I met her at the front door, opening it before she could knock. "Richard," she said with a smile that seemed genuine, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. David said you'd been having some work done on the house, and I was curious to see how it turned out." "Of course, come in." She entered with the casual confidence of someone who felt entitled to access, but I noticed the way her eyes immediately began cataloging changes. The new locks, the barely visible cameras, the tablet sitting on the side table showing the house's environmental controls. "Quite an upgrade," she said, studying the smart thermostat panel. "This must have cost a fortune." Margaret left funds specifically for home improvements. "Really? I didn't know she'd been planning renovations." The comment was delivered casually, but I heard the lawyer's interest beneath it, as if Margaret's financial planning was somehow relevant to Jessica's assessment of my competence. "She was always thinking ahead," I said. "Coffee? That would be lovely." I led her to the kitchen, where the automated coffee system had begun brewing the afternoon pot according to the schedule Jake had programmed. Jessica watched with obvious fascination as I adjusted the strength and temperature from the wall-mounted control panel. "This is incredible, Richard, like something from a high-tech hotel. It's designed to make daily life easier and safer." "Safer how?" I demonstrated the emergency alert system, showing her how I could summon help with a single button press, how the system would automatically contact emergency services if it detected a fall or medical emergency, how every entrance and exit was monitored and recorded. "So, you're never really alone," she said, and I couldn't tell if she was impressed or concerned. "I'm as alone as I choose to be, but if I need help, it's immediately available." We sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where Margaret and I had shared thousands of meals and conversations. Through the window, the lake stretched toward distant hills that were just beginning to show the bare branches of late autumn. "Richard," Jessica said, setting down her coffee cup with the careful precision of someone preparing to shift into professional mode, "I want to be honest with you about something. David asked me to come here today." I assumed as much. "He's worried about you, we all are, not because we think you're incompetent. This house and all this technology proves you're perfectly capable of taking care of yourself, but because we think you're working too hard to prove something that doesn't need proving." "What do you think I'm trying to prove? That you don't need help, that you can manage everything alone, that accepting support from family would somehow be a sign of weakness." She leaned forward, her expression earnest. "But, Richard, needing help isn't a character flaw. It's just a fact of life as we get older. And accepting that help from people who love you isn't surrender, it's wisdom." The words were carefully chosen, delivered with the skill of someone who'd spent years persuading juries. But they were also familiar, variations on the same theme David had been playing since this whole campaign began. "Jessica," I said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you look at this house, what do you see?" She glanced around the kitchen, her gaze taking in the smart appliances, the perfect organization, the obvious care that had gone into every detail. "I see a beautiful home that's been lovingly maintained. And when you think about my future, what concerns you most?" A pause. "Honestly, I worry that you're isolated here, that if something happened, A medical emergency, a fall, even just a power outage, you might not be able to get the help you need quickly enough. Those are reasonable concerns, I said. That's why Margaret arranged for all this. I gestured toward the technology that now surrounded us. Every risk you have mentioned has been addressed. Medical emergency, automatic alerts to paramedics, fall detection, sensors throughout the house, power outage, backup systems that can run for days. But what about companionship? What about having family nearby who can check on you regularly, spend time with you, make sure you're not just surviving but actually enjoying life? The question struck at something deeper than practical concerns. It touched on the loneliness that had become my constant companion since Margaret's death, the silence that filled the rooms where laughter used to echo. "Jessica," I said slowly, "when was the last time you visited me just because you wanted to spend time together? Not because David asked you to check on me, not because there was some practical matter to discuss, but just because you enjoyed my company." Her cheeks flushed slightly. That's not fair, isn't it? You're asking me to believe that proximity would solve the problem of isolation. But isolation is not about geography, it's about connection. And connection can't be solved by putting me in a facility where visiting becomes more convenient for everyone else. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the lake that had been the constant backdrop for my marriage. This house isn't just where I live, Jessica. It's where Margaret and I built our life together. Every room holds conversations we had, decisions we made, dreams we shared. Moving me away from all of that wouldn't cure my loneliness. It would complete it. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had lost its professional polish. "I think I understand that. But Richard, what happens when maintaining all of this becomes too much? When the technology fails, or the isolation becomes unbearable, or your health changes in ways that make independent living impossible? Then I'll make different choices. But they'll be my choices, made when I'm ready to make them, not when other people decide it's convenient." The security system chimed softly, alerting me to another vehicle in the driveway. The camera feed showed David's BMW pulling up behind Jessica's car. "He was supposed to wait in town," Jessica said, looking embarrassed. "But he couldn't resist checking up on how his reconnaissance mission was going." She had the grace to look ashamed. "Richard, I'm sorry. This wasn't supposed to be manipulative. We really are concerned about your welfare. I know you are, but concern that leads to deception isn't really concern, it's control." David knocked on the front door, though the smart lock would have admitted him if I'd programmed his fingerprint into the system. I hadn't. I opened the door manually, noting how the action was recorded by multiple cameras and logged by the security system with precise timestamps. "Dad," David said, slightly out of breath as if he'd been hurrying. "I was just in town and thought I'd stop by. I hope that's okay." Of course, Jessica and I were just having coffee. He entered and immediately began the same visual inventory Jessica had conducted, cataloging changes, assessing upgrades, calculating costs. But where Jessica's examination had been subtle, David's was blatant. "This is incredible," he said, studying the control panel by the door. "How much did all this cost?" And Margaret left specific funds for home improvements. But this is way beyond basic improvements. This is like a command center. I led them back to the kitchen, where the smart home system continued its quiet operation, adjusting temperature, monitoring security, maintaining the comfortable environment that Margaret had envisioned for my independent life. "It's designed to address every safety concern you've raised," I said. "Medical emergencies, security issues, emergency communication, daily activity monitoring, everything you said you were worried about." David sat down heavily at the kitchen table. "Dad, I have to ask, are you doing all this just to prove you don't need to move?" "I'm doing this because it's what Margaret wanted, because it allows me to live safely in the home we built together, because it provides the security you claim to be concerned about while preserving the independence you seem determined to eliminate. That's not what we're trying to do, isn't it? You want me in a facility where other people control my schedule, my meals, my visitors, my activities, where every aspect of daily life is managed by someone else for my own supposed good." I gestured toward the technology surrounding us. "This gives me the same safety benefits with none of the loss of autonomy. I can live in my own home, maintain my own routines, welcome my own guests, and still have immediate access to help if I need it." Jessica leaned forward. "But Richard, what about social interaction? What about having people your own age to spend time with? You mean people who have also been separated from everything they built during their lifetimes and convinced that dependence is preferable to self-determination. The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but I didn't apologize for them. The underlying assumption that age automatically meant a desire to be managed rather than respected was something I was no longer willing to accept politely. David's jaw tightened. "Dad, you're being unreasonable. We're trying to help you." "No," I said quietly. "You're trying to solve the problem of having a father who requires consideration and effort. Moving me to a facility doesn't help me. It helps you by making me someone else's responsibility." The silence that followed was thick with tension. The smart home system continued its quiet operation around us, monitoring, recording, documenting everything that was said and done in its presence. Finally, David stood up. "I think we should go." "I think you should." They left without finishing their coffee, their footsteps recorded by sensors in the hallway, their departure time-stamped by the security system. I watched from the kitchen window as they stood beside their cars, having what appeared to be an intense conversation before driving away. Alone again, I sat in Margaret's reading chair with the system control tablet, reviewing the afternoon's recordings. Every word of our conversation had been captured by the home's audio monitoring system. Every expression of concern, every subtle threat, every attempt at manipulation was now part of a digital record that would be very difficult to dismiss in any legal proceeding. But more than that, the afternoon had crystallized something I'd been struggling to understand since this whole campaign began. David and Jessica weren't really concerned about my safety or my welfare. They were concerned about their own convenience, their own peace of mind, their own ability to manage the challenge of having an aging parent without the complications that independent living presented. The smart home system Margaret had arranged wasn't just about keeping me safe. It was about documenting my competence, recording my capability, creating an unassailable record that I was managing my life successfully and independently. As evening fell over Clearview Lake, I programmed the system to begin its nighttime routine, adjusting temperature for optimal sleep, activating security protocols, monitoring for any unusual activity. But I also activated features Jake had shown me for what he'd called extended monitoring. If David and Jessica were going to escalate their efforts to remove me from my home, I wanted every interaction documented, every visit recorded, every attempt at manipulation preserved, with the kind of precision that would make their true motives impossible to deny. The war for our sanctuary was entering a new phase, one where technology would serve as both shield and sword. Margaret had understood that the battle wouldn't be won through emotional appeals or family loyalty. It would be won through documentation, preparation, and the kind of evidence that lawyers and judges respected more than tears or sentiment. I activated the system's comprehensive monitoring mode and settled in for what I suspected would be a very interesting few weeks. They wanted to prove I was incompetent to live alone. Instead, they were about to provide overwhelming evidence of exactly the opposite. The house hummed quietly around me, every system functioning perfectly, every sensor alert and responsive. Margaret's gift wasn't just technology. It was the ultimate expression of her faith in my ability to defend what we'd built together. Tomorrow, I would begin to understand just how right she'd been. The decision to send the invitations came on a December morning when frost covered Margaret's garden like a crystalline shroud, preserving the last roses of the season in perfect frozen beauty. I'd been watching the security feeds for 3 weeks, documenting David's increasingly frequent drive-bys, Jessica's careful reconnaissance visits disguised as social tools, and Harold's obvious property assessments conducted from the public road. They thought they were being subtle. The smart home system recorded everything with digital precision. I pulled out Margaret's personal stationery, the cream-colored paper with her initials embossed in gold that she'd used for the most important correspondence of our marriage. Birth announcements, sympathy notes, invitations to celebrations that mattered. Now it would serve one final purpose. The words came easily, as if Margaret herself were guiding my pen. Mr. and Mrs. David Hartwell, Mr. and Mrs. Harold Winters. You are cordially invited to dinner at Clearview Lake, Saturday, December 21st. 7 o'clock in the evening. We have important family matters to discuss, and there are documents that require your attention. Formal attire requested. Richard Hartwell. I sealed each invitation in its own envelope, addressing them in the careful script Margaret had taught me during our early years together, when she'd insisted that handwritten correspondence was a dying art worth preserving. The timing was deliberate. December 21st was the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, when darkness held dominion and light seemed furthest away. It was also 3 days before Christmas Eve, when family obligations weighed heaviest, and the mythology of holiday reconciliation made people more vulnerable to sentiment. Most importantly, it was the anniversary of the day Margaret and I had first walked through the empty lot that would become our sanctuary, when we'd stood among bare trees and frozen ground and envisioned the life we would build together. She would have appreciated the symbolism. I drove to town that afternoon to deliver the invitations personally, handing them to David at his real estate office and to Harold and Patricia at the country club where they had been having lunch. The reactions were immediate and telling. David opened his invitation while I stood in his office, his expression shifting from surprise to calculation to something that might have been anticipation. "Dad, this is great. I'm glad you want to discuss things as a family. We do need to discuss things. Should I bring anything, papers, documents, anything like that?" The eagerness in his voice confirmed what I'd already suspected. He thought this dinner was my surrender, my admission that they'd been right about the impracticality of my independent living arrangement. "Just yourselves," I said. "I'll handle everything else." Harold and Patricia's reaction was even more revealing. They opened their invitation at their country club table, surrounded by the kind of people who measured success by the obvious accumulation of assets and influence. "How lovely," Patricia said, loud enough for neighboring tables to hear. "Richard has finally decided to discuss practical arrangements. I suppose living alone all winter has been quite an education for him." Harold nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose patience had finally been rewarded. These situations usually resolve themselves once reality sets in. Pride can only sustain so much isolation. I left them to their assumptions and drove home through the December afternoon, past fields covered in snow and trees bare against a sky the color of pewter. The house waited for me like a faithful servant, its smart systems maintaining perfect temperature and lighting, its security cameras recording the approach of the man who would soon use it as the stage for what might be the most important performance of his life. The preparations took 3 days. Not because the menu was complicated, I'd decided on simplicity over complexity for this final meal, but because every detail needed to carry symbolic weight. This wasn't just dinner, it was theater, and like all effective theater, success would depend on the careful orchestration of setting, timing, and revelation. I started with Marcus Webb's office, where the final legal documents waited in a manila folder, sealed with the kind of red wax usually reserved for state occasions. The new will, the trust papers, the charitable donation agreements, everything Margaret had envisioned, and Marcus had refined into legally unassailable form. "Are you certain about this approach, Richard?" Marcus asked as he handed me the folder. "Once these documents are revealed, there's no going back. Your relationship with David may be permanently altered." "It's already permanently altered," I replied. "The question is whether it ends with honesty or deception." The house preparation was equally meticulous. I polished Margaret's silver until it gleamed, pressed the tablecloth she'd embroidered during our 15th year of marriage, arranged the china we'd received as wedding gifts and used only for the most special occasions. The dining room became a shrine to everything we'd built together: photographs from 4 decades of marriage, awards I'd received for construction projects, certificates of appreciation for Margaret's volunteer work with veterans' families. But the centerpiece was something none of them had seen before: Margaret's final letter to me, the one I'd found in her jewelry box, sealed now in a silver frame that caught the candlelight and made her words seem to glow with their own inner fire. The menu was Margaret's, not her most elaborate meal, but her most meaningful: beef tenderloin with the horseradish cream sauce she'd perfected for our anniversary dinners, roasted winter vegetables from the garden she'd planted to provide food through the cold months, chocolate mousse made with a recipe her grandmother had brought from France and taught to 3 generations of women who understood that some traditions were worth preserving, regardless of the effort required, and wine. The 1985 Chateau Margaux that Margaret and I had been saving for our 50th anniversary, the bottle that represented not just celebration, but the faith that we would have something to celebrate when the time came. We hadn't lived to share it together, but perhaps it could serve a different purpose, marking not a beginning, but an ending that honored everything we'd meant to each other. Saturday arrived with the kind of crystalline winter weather that made every surface sharp and bright. I spent the morning in Margaret's greenhouse, cutting the last roses that had survived the first hard freezes, arranging them in the cut crystal vase she'd inherited from her grandmother. The flowers were perfect, white with edges touched by frost, beautiful in their fragility, precious because they represented the final blooms of the season. By 6 o'clock, the house was ready. The smart home system had adjusted lighting to its most flattering settings, warmed the air to the exact temperature Margaret had always preferred for entertaining, and begun playing the classical music she'd chosen for formal dinners. Every camera was active, every recording device enabled, every sensor prepared to document whatever would unfold in the next few hours. I dressed in the navy suit Margaret had bought me for our 40th anniversary, the one she'd said made me look distinguished rather than merely old. The pocket watch her father had given me on our wedding day went into my vest pocket, its steady tick a reminder that time moved forward regardless of human wishes or regrets. At 7 o'clock precisely, headlights swept across the snow-covered driveway. Two cars, David's BMW and Harold's Mercedes, their occupants dressed for what they probably imagined would be a negotiation disguised as a family meal. I opened the front door before they could knock, the smart lock's biometric reader confirming my identity with a soft chime that none of them would recognize as anything more than decorative sound. "Welcome," I said, stepping back to admit them into the warmth and light of the house Margaret and I had built together. Their reactions were immediate and profound. David stopped just inside the threshold, his eyes taking in the formal table setting, the carefully arranged photographs, the obvious evidence that this evening was meant to be significant rather than casual. Jessica appeared genuinely moved by the elegance of the presentation, her professional composure softening as she absorbed the care that had gone into every detail. Harold and Patricia entered with the confident expectation of people who believed they were about to witness my capitulation to practical reality, but even they seemed subdued by the obvious formality of the occasion. "Dad," David said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty I hadn't heard since his childhood, "this is beautiful, just like Mom used to do for special occasions." "This is a special occasion," I replied, taking their coats and hanging them in the closet, where Margaret's winter jacket still waited for a season that would never come. "Perhaps the most important dinner this house has ever seen." I offered them drinks in the living room, pouring wine from bottles Margaret had selected years ago for entertaining guests who mattered. The fire I'd built in the stone fireplace cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the room feel intimate and slightly mysterious. "Richard," Harold said, settling into the leather chair with the proprietary air I'd come to recognize as his default mode, "we're grateful you've decided to approach this situation more collaboratively." "Approach what situation?" "Your living arrangements, your future care needs, the practical realities that we've all been concerned about." I sipped my wine and smiled. "Yes, we certainly need to discuss practical realities." Patricia leaned forward, her expression warm with what she probably thought was grandmotherly concern. "We've been doing quite a bit of research, Richard. There are some wonderful facilities that specialize in active seniors, places where you could maintain your independence while having access to support services when you need them. Have you selected one in particular?" "Well, yes, actually." Jessica opened her purse and withdrew a glossy brochure. "Sunset Manor has everything. Private apartments, dining services, activities programs, medical care on site, and it's only 40 minutes from David's office. So, family visits would be much easier." "Easier for whom?" The question hung in the air for a moment before David answered. "Easier for all of us, Dad. You wouldn't have to worry about maintaining this big house, and we wouldn't have to worry about you being isolated out here if something happened." I stood and moved to the mantelpiece where Margaret's photograph smiled down at the room she'd decorated with such care. "And what would happen to this house?" Another exchange of glances, the silent communication of people who'd rehearsed their responses to expected questions. "We've looked into that too," Harold said. "The property has remarkable development potential. With proper subdivision, it could provide more than enough funds to ensure your comfort for the rest of your life." "Subdivision," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air like smoke from a fire that had gotten out of control. "The lakefront alone is worth substantial money," Patricia added, "and the main house could be renovated as a luxury retreat center. The possibilities are really quite exciting." I turned to look at them. These four people who'd invaded my sanctuary with their practical solutions and efficient plans, who saw 47 years of marriage as nothing more than real estate opportunity waiting to be optimized. "Exciting," I said quietly. "Yes, I can see how you'd find it exciting." David set down his wineglass with unnecessary precision. "Dad, I know this is emotional for you, but emotion can't be the only consideration when making decisions this important. What should be the primary consideration? Reality, financial responsibility, making sure your assets are managed in ways that serve your best interests." "My best interests," I repeated. Tell me, David, when you think about my best interests, what comes to mind first? My happiness or your convenience? His face flushed. That's not fair. Isn't it? You want me in a facility 40 minutes from your office. You want this property subdivided and developed. You want my assets managed in ways that eliminate any inconvenience or complexity from your life. How exactly do those things serve my interests rather than yours? The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the soft chiming of the grandfather clock, marking another quarter hour in what was becoming a very long evening. Perhaps, I said, we should move to the dining room. Dinner is ready. The dining room had been transformed into something magical. Candlelight reflected off silver and crystal, casting warm light on walls hung with photographs that chronicled 4 decades of life lived with purpose and intention. Margaret's roses provided splashes of color against the white tablecloth, their fragrance mixing with the aroma of beef tenderloin and roasted vegetables. But it was the framed letter at the center of the table that drew their attention. Margaret's final words to me, written in her careful script and sealed behind glass like a sacred document. "What's that?" Jessica asked, pointing to the frame. "Something Margaret left for me. Instructions about how to handle situations exactly like this one." I served the meal with the same care Margaret had always used, explaining each dish, sharing the stories behind family recipes, creating the kind of conversation she'd believed made dining an art rather than merely a necessity. But as the meal progressed, I could feel their impatience growing. They'd come here expecting negotiation, expecting to present their solutions and receive my grateful acceptance. Instead, they were receiving a lesson in the meaning of hospitality, the importance of tradition, the value of taking time to appreciate what had been created rather than rushing to dispose of it. Finally, as I served the chocolate mousse Margaret's grandmother had taught her to make, Harold cleared his throat with the authority of someone who'd decided to take control of a situation that wasn't proceeding according to plan. "Richard, this has been a lovely evening, but I think we should discuss the practical matters that brought us together." "Of course." I stood and moved to the sideboard where I'd placed the manila folder Marcus had prepared. "I have some documents here that I think you'll find very interesting." I returned to the table and set the folder down next to Margaret's framed letter, my hands steady despite the magnitude of what was about to unfold. "Before we discuss your plans for my future," I said, "I thought you should know about the plans I've already made." I opened the folder and removed the first document, the new will that transferred everything they'd been coveting to people and organizations that would use it as Margaret and I had intended. "This is my last will and testament, executed 3 weeks ago with proper legal counsel and witnessed according to all applicable statutes." David leaned forward to read, his expression shifting from curiosity to confusion to something approaching panic as he absorbed the contents. "Dad, what is this?" "It's exactly what it says. Upon my death, this house and property will be donated to the Healing Waters Retreat, a veterans organization that provides counseling and temporary housing for military families dealing with PTSD and related challenges." Jessica grabbed the document, her lawyer's eyes scanning the technical language with professional speed. "Richard, you can't do this without consulting family members. There are legal procedures. There are no legal procedures that require me to consult anyone about the disposition of my own assets," I interrupted. "I am of sound mind, acting without duress, and fully competent to make decisions about property I own outright." I removed the second document, the trust papers that protected my remaining assets from exactly the kind of family interference they were now threatening. "My financial assets have been placed in an irrevocable trust that will provide income for my lifetime and then distribute the remaining funds according to my specific instructions." Harold's face had gone pale. "Richard, this is madness. You're giving away a fortune to strangers while your own family—" "My own family," I said, my voice still quiet but carrying the weight of absolute finality, "has spent the last month trying to convince me that I'm incompetent to manage my own affairs. You've researched facilities to warehouse me, evaluated my property for development potential, and made plans for my future without once asking what I might want for myself." I stood and walked to the window that looked out over Clearview Lake, its dark surface reflecting stars that Margaret and I had wished upon for 47 years. "You see this house as an asset to be liquidated. I see it as a sanctuary that should continue serving its original purpose. You see my attachment to it as sentiment that needs to be overcome. I see it as a responsibility that needs to be honored." Patricia's voice was shrill with indignation. "You're punishing us for caring about your welfare." I turned back to face them. These four people who'd shared Margaret's dinner table and were now learning that their months of manipulation had achieved exactly the opposite of what they'd intended. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm making sure that what Margaret and I built together serves the purpose we always intended, providing healing and refuge for people who need both. David's voice broke like a teenager's. But I'm your son. This house, this property, it should be mine someday. Why? The question caught him off guard. Because I'm your child. Because that's how families work. Is it? Tell me, David, what have you done to earn this inheritance beyond the accident of your birth? I've been your son for 37 years. Yes. And for the last several months, you've been planning to remove me from my home and subdivide the property we built together. That's not the behavior of someone who deserves to inherit a sanctuary. That's the behavior of someone who sees love as a transaction. I returned to the table and removed the final document from the folder, the letter I had written to them weeks ago, when I'd first understood the true nature of their concern. This is for you, I said, handing it to David, an explanation of why I've made these decisions and what you'll need to do if you ever want to be part of my life again. He opened it with shaking hands, reading words I'd written with Margaret's spirit guiding my pen. To my son and his family, love is not a negotiation. It cannot be earned through manipulation or sustained through control. It requires respect, honesty, and the kind of trust that allows people to make their own choices about their own lives. You have shown me that you no longer trust my judgment, respect my autonomy, or value my happiness above your own convenience. These are not the behaviors of people who love. These are the behaviors of people who want to manage. I will not be managed. Not by my own family, not by well-meaning strangers, not by anyone who confuses their anxiety with my incompetence. If you wish to be part of my life going forward, you will need to demonstrate that you understand the difference between caring for someone and controlling them. You will need to prove that you value my happiness more than your peace of mind. Until then, you are welcome to visit as guests, but you are no longer welcome to participate in decisions about my life. This is not punishment. This is a boundary. With love that hopes for better, Dad, the silence that followed was profound. David stared at the letter, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more palatable. Jessica studied the legal documents with the intensity of someone looking for loopholes that didn't exist. Harold and Patricia sat frozen in their chairs, apparently unable to process that their careful plans had been so thoroughly demolished. Finally, David looked up, his eyes bright with tears that might have been grief or anger or simple shock. Dad, you can't mean this. We're family. Yes, I said quietly. We are. And families survive boundaries. They die in their absence. I walked to Margaret's photograph on the mantelpiece, touching the silver frame that held her image. Your mother spent her final months preparing for exactly this situation. She knew that good intentions could become indistinguishable from selfishness, that concern could be used to justify control, that families could suffocate love under layers of practical considerations. I turned back to face them, my voice steady with the certainty that came from finally understanding what Margaret had been trying to teach me. She left me everything I needed to protect what we'd built together: legal documents, financial resources, and most importantly, the wisdom to recognize when protection was necessary. Jessica stood abruptly, her professional composure finally cracking. Richard, this is emotional manipulation. You're using grief and sentiment to justify decisions that make no financial sense. I'm using love and loyalty to preserve something that matters more than money. The veterans organization you're giving this to, do they even know about your plans? I smiled for the first time since they had arrived. They've known for 3 weeks. Their director has visited twice to discuss how the property will be used. They're as excited about the possibilities as you are about subdivision and development. Harold stood as well, his face red with the kind of anger that comes from having certainty destroyed by unexpected facts. Richard, you're making a terrible mistake. You're giving away your children's inheritance to strangers who won't remember your name 5 years after you're gone. I'm ensuring that my children's inheritance includes something more valuable than money. The knowledge that their father stood for something, that he honored his commitments, that he chose principle over convenience when the choice mattered most. David pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the hardwood floors Margaret and I had refinished together during our 10th year in the house. This isn't over, he said, his voice carrying the kind of threat that adults make when they've forgotten how to ask for what they need. Yes, I replied calmly. It is. They left in stages, first Harold and Patricia, muttering about legal challenges and family obligations, then Jessica, carrying the documents she probably hoped to contest. Finally David, who paused at the door as if he might find words that could undo everything that had been said. "Dad," he whispered, "I do love you. Maybe not the way you want to be loved, but I do love you. I know you do, son. But love without respect is just sentiment. And I'm too old for sentiment." After they were gone, I cleared the table with the same care Margaret had always used, washing each piece of china by hand, polishing the silver until it gleamed, storing everything exactly where it belonged for whatever occasions might come in the future. The house settled with familiar sounds, the clock, the furnace, the soft creak of old timber. For the first time since Margaret's death, they felt peaceful rather than lonely. I built a fire and sat in her chair with a glass of Chateau Margaux we had saved for our golden anniversary. The wine was perfect, complex, elegant, worthy of what it symbolized. We hadn't reached 50 years, but we had built something lasting, a sanctuary that would outlive us. The smart home recorded everything, my quiet routine, the settling of a house finally at peace. Margaret's photograph smiled from the mantel, approving my choice to honor what we created rather than yield to pressure. "We did it, Maggie," I whispered. "We protected our sanctuary." Outside, snow fell, covering lake and woods in silent beauty. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't fighting alone. The house hummed softly. Every system working, every room proof that love can be preserved as well as remembered. Tomorrow would bring challenges, legal threats, estrangement, solitude. But tonight, I sat in the home Margaret and I had built, certain that some battles are worth the cost. The invitation had served its purpose. The dinner delivered its message. The document sealed the fate I chose, not the one others imagined. In the morning, I would begin the next chapter, not as someone managed or controlled, but as guardian of a sanctuary meant to heal long after I was gone. That night, I raised my glass to the woman whose wisdom made victory possible, and to a love strong enough to endure even those who tried to take it away. Christmas morning broke with quiet after the snowfall, and for the first time in months, I woke rested, without fear of calls or confrontations. Coffee in hand, I watched the lake glow under winter light. The house was warm, secure, and finally at peace. The phone stayed silent, no David, no lawyers, only calm. Later that morning, I confirmed plans with Healing Waters Retreat. The property would serve families in need, while I remained in the rooms Margaret and I had shared. Her garden would become a place of recovery, exactly as she had imagined. Neighbors stopped by with food and quiet respect, and by spring the first veteran families arrived. Their children played in the yard where David once had, laughter filling spaces that had long felt empty. For the first time since Margaret's death, the house lived again. Months later, David called. His voice was subdued. He had seen the article about the retreat, and he admitted he had been wrong, confusing control with love. He asked if we might rebuild, not as adversaries, but honestly. I told him he could visit, but only as a guest who respected boundaries. That night, I sat by the fire with Margaret's photograph, feeling her approval. The war for our sanctuary was over. The house would endure as a place of healing, and my legacy, our legacy, was safe. For the first time in years, I felt not only at peace, but truly alive again.